Ginger Baker was more than just the fiery heartbeat behind legendary rock bands like Cream and Blind Faith. He was a man of contradictions, constantly teetering between genius creativity and sheer self-destruction. Some called him the greatest drummer alive. Others insisted he was a volatile menace with a mean streak longer than his drum solos. But underneath the reputation for explosive tantrums and groundbreaking percussion lies a story few people know. A story of olive groves on Tuscan hillsides, shadowy underworld threats, and a desperate attempt to outrun his own demons. Before we dive into that uproarious chapter, let's wind back a bit and see how this wild ride got started. From the very beginning, Peter Edward Ginger Baker stood out. Born in 1939 to a family in Lewisham, South London, he displayed a restlessness that his teachers and neighbours couldn't quite handle. As a teenager, he found the drums, unleashing a fearless style that would later redefine rock percussion. This wasn't just a kid tapping out a beat, it was an explosive, freewheeling approach that drew on jazz, African rhythms, and an irreverent determination to break every rule in the drummer's handbook. By the mid-1960s, Baker had carved a reputation in the British music scene. He teamed up with bassist Jack Bruce and guitarist Eric Clapton to form Cream, one of the earliest supergroups in rock history. The combination of his flamboyant solos, Bruce's melodic prowess, and Clapton's fiery guitar transformed Cream into an unstoppable force. Audiences were left breathless by Baker's performances. He would leap behind the kit like a man possessed, pounding out furious rhythms that gave new meaning to the word intensity. But the very elements that fueled Baker's genius often set off interpersonal fireworks. Cream's internal clashes were epic. Baker's volcanic temper met Jack Bruce's equally strong personality head-on, and the tension between them became as legendary as their music. Still, the public couldn't get enough. While Baker attacked the drums with the precision of a craftsman and the fury of a hurricane, fans were enthralled by the raw, unpredictable energy of each performance. It's said that if you saw Cream live, you got more than a rock concert. You witnessed a war of wills, with Baker often at its center. After Cream disbanded, Baker kept pushing the boundaries. He formed Blind Faith with Clapton, Steve Winwood, and Rick Gresh. Even that lineup, brimming with talent, couldn't survive the friction. In typical Baker style, personal disagreements and creative differences overshadowed the band's potential. Blind Faith faded almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind just one album and a handful of performances. Yet Baker's drum work stood out, confirming to everyone that he was an unstoppable force, erratic, brilliant, and deeply troubled. Talent can catapult a musician to the top of the charts, but it can't shield anyone from life's darker temptations. Baker's roller coaster ride featured a destructive pull towards substances that would nearly derail him for good. He once claimed he used horse, as he sometimes called it, for decades, managing to teeter on the brink without completely toppling over. Close friends said he grew unpredictable, unhinged, even dangerous when the cravings took over. Stories spread through the music world about Baker's unfiltered outbursts, late-night rampages, and debts left unpaid. One of the most notorious chapters in this spiral was his move to Lagos, Nigeria, in the early 1970s. There, he forged a creative alliance with the famed musician Fela Kuti, hoping to blend Western rock with African rhythms. In some ways, this was Baker at his absolute finest, immersing himself in a different culture, testing musical frontiers that no Western rock star had touched. Together, they jammed in Kuti's Afrobeat style, laying down tracks that still sound revolutionary today. But the synergy was overshadowed by mounting personal chaos. Baker opened a recording space called Batakota, often referred to as Batakota Studios, dreaming it could become a global hub for cross-cultural musical fusion. Instead, it became a flashpoint for Baker's problems. Financial trouble and Baker's fractious relationships made the situation increasingly dangerous, culminating in rumors of extortion, gunfire, and a hasty exodus. Depending on who tells the story, Baker was either a visionary stifled by corruption or a foreign troublemaker in over his head. Whichever version you believe, it ended the same way, with Baker fleeing the country and leaving behind a wrecked enterprise. He eventually admitted that his heroin habit was out of control. Nigeria may have inspired him musically, but it also brought his personal demons into sharper focus. The fiasco left him craving a fresh start, one far away from music industry drama and drug dens. Little did he realize, though, that his next destination would prove no less tumultuous. By the time he found himself gazing at the rolling hills of Tuscany, Baker had lost almost everything. His finances were in ruins, his relationships in tatters, and his health precarious. Yet there remained a stubborn spark of hope. In Italy, he saw a chance to reinvent himself as a man of the land, cultivating olives under the expansive Mediterranean sky. Far removed from the spotlights, the hangers-on, and the city streets pulsing with temptations, he believed he could finally tackle his addictions and regain some semblance of normalcy. Tuscany seemed like the perfect backdrop for this transformation. For centuries, the region's gentle pace and pastoral tranquility have drawn creative souls from around the globe. Baker wanted a solitary refuge where he'd be forced to commune with nature and confront himself, without the distractions he'd known for years. The property he purchased was no rustic paradise at first glance. It was a ramshackle farmhouse high on a mountain, nearly inaccessible, with walls threatening to crumble at the slightest gust of wind. Local villagers were bewildered by the sudden arrival of this wild-eyed Englishman. He spoke little Italian, drove through narrow roads at breakneck speed, and didn't bother explaining himself. On the surface, Baker's new passion was simple: coax the olive trees into producing top-quality oil. But behind his gruff determination lay a fragile hope that physical labor could keep his mind off the cravings that lurked in every shadow. Morning started before sunrise, with Baker trudging outside to check on the trees. The orchard needed constant attention, pruning branches, controlling pests, and hauling equipment up steep slopes. The heat in Tuscan summers can be relentless, but Baker rarely complained. Perhaps the punishing routine was precisely the distraction he craved. To him, each cut of the pruning shears was an act of defiance against his own self-destructive urges. Still, no matter how far he ran, Ginger Baker couldn't entirely shake off music. Even in Tuscany, a battered drum kit found its way into an upstairs room with a panoramic view of the mountains. After a grueling day struggling to irrigate parched soil or repair parts of the sagging farmhouse roof, he'd retreat to that makeshift studio. The neighbors must have found it surreal. From somewhere high on the hill, the unmistakable thunder of Baker's drumming echoed through the evening air. Some days he'd practice for hours, losing himself in intricate polyrhythms. It was as though he wanted to fuse his new rural life with the primal power of his drumming. The clash of such extremes, a quiet olive orchard and the roiling chaos of rock percussion, spoke volumes about Baker's divided soul. On one hand, he wanted solitude, redemption, and an escape from the mania of his former life. On the other hand, that mania was woven into his very being. Local rumors flourished. Was he a deranged ex-rock star? Was he secretly running illicit operations from his farmhouse? Gossip can be relentless in small communities, and Baker's unpredictable behavior only fueled it. He was prone to profanity-laden outbursts when frustrated. Sometimes he'd vanish into town for supplies and return days later in a foul mood, if he returned at all. The villagers couldn't decide whether to treat him as a recluse, a danger, or just a bizarre eccentric who'd chosen their picturesque corner of the world to vanish. As if Baker's personal challenges weren't enough, a new threat emerged from the most unexpected corner: rumors about local Mafia involvement. Tuscany, for all its beauty and culinary fame, is not free from criminal elements. Whether through direct intimidation or subtle economic pressures, certain Mafia-affiliated groups have historically kept an eye on lucrative or strategic pieces of land. It remains unclear why they took an interest in Baker's ramshackle farm. Perhaps they suspected he was funneling money through his olive venture, or maybe they simply took offense to his abrasive style. In any case, the rumors that he was running a drug operation on the property began to circulate in criminal circles. True or not, these rumors could be enough to draw unwelcome attention. One version of the story suggests that local toughs came by to check on Baker's operation, only to find nothing but a few dogs, broken furniture, and a half-renovated farmhouse. Another version insists that Baker tried to sell his olive oil directly to certain distributors without knowing who they really were. Regardless of how it started, tensions brewed. An outsider like Baker, loud and unafraid to speak his mind, wasn't likely to handle intimidation quietly. When the threats began, Baker initially shrugged them off. He had faced down hostile crowds, complicated business associates, and even armed men in Nigeria. But the simple fact is that in the shadowy corners of Tuscany, the game was different. One evening, he discovered one of his beloved dogs had been killed. He understood immediately. This was a personal warning. For a man who fiercely trusted his animals more than any human, it was the ultimate betrayal, and a sign he was in real danger. In the wake of that violent act, Baker's romantic vision of an idyllic life on the land shattered. Even if he had managed to wrestle his own demons into submission in Tuscany, the outside world refused to give him peace. He no longer felt safe. Villagers whispered that he was a marked man, that his feud with these mysterious figures could escalate at any moment. At first, Baker tried to stand his ground. Stubbornness was practically part of his DNA. But the tragedy with his dog shook him deeply. It brought back every betrayal and heartbreak he'd lived through. One night, after a string of sleepless evenings spent pacing his property, Baker made up his mind. The orchard he had tried so hard to nurture was no longer a sanctuary. He loaded what he could into his old vehicle, mustered enough energy to get the rest of his dogs inside, and disappeared down the winding Tuscan roads. A few neighbours recalled seeing the headlights in the early morning, descending the hill for the last time. He left behind olive trees, half-finished repairs, and a quiet sense of dread that still lingered among the locals who'd been watching this improbable saga from a distance. In that final decision, Baker let go of the only place he'd ever really tried to call home outside of music. After multiple collapses, broken bands, broken relationships, and broken finances, this was the closest he'd come to forging a new identity, and it ended in heartbreak. No matter how fervently he craved escape from the storms he'd created around himself, the storms seemed destined to follow. Running from Tuscan threats, Baker found himself in a place that couldn't be more different: Hollywood. The neon-lit city of reinvention beckoned with false promises. For a man who spent years defying every convention, the world of acting must have seemed both amusing and perplexing. He dipped his toe into film, briefly fantasizing about a new career. If music had betrayed him, or he had betrayed it, perhaps the movies offered a fresh script. That detour didn't last long. His volatile temper and refusal to take direction made him a difficult fit for the film industry's carefully choreographed demands. Hollywood parties felt like a replay of the rock star carnage he was trying to escape. Instead, Baker gravitated back to his comfort zone: music. Bill Laswell, a savvy producer, recognized Baker's brilliance and approached him for collaboration. The idea was to fuse Baker's African-inspired beats with avant-garde rock and even electronic elements. For a moment, it seemed like the drummer's genius would once again overshadow his destructive impulses. He contributed his distinctive drum patterns to various projects, showing flashes of the old brilliance that had so captivated crowds in the 1960s and 70s. Critics raved about the raw energy Baker still possessed. Watching him behind a kit, thrashing out those polyrhythms at an age when most rock stars have long settled into greatest hits tours, left many in awe. Yet the spectre of conflict never fully receded. Whether it was a dispute over payment or his incendiary remarks about former bandmates, Baker always stood on the brink of a new feud. To trace Ginger Baker's life is to map a series of clashes between bandmates, substances, fans, critics, criminals, and most importantly, his own nature. The Tuscan chapter, with its hopeful start and violent end, is a perfect distillation of what made Baker such a compelling enigma. He wanted peace, yet bristled at authority. He yearned for solitude, yet couldn't abandon the spotlight entirely. He craved a break from the rock world, but ultimately found that the rhythms of music were embedded in his soul. When he left Tuscany, he also left behind any illusions that he could exist quietly on the fringes of civilization. He had drawn a line in the sand, testing whether he could transform himself into a humble caretaker of olive groves. Instead, that pursuit led him into yet another collision with forces bigger and darker than himself. Some might say he was doomed to sabotage every dream he had, while others believed destiny, or simply his own fiery temper, chose a perpetual cycle of upheaval. Ginger Baker's journey did not end in the Tuscan hills, nor did it conclude in Hollywood's glare. He would continue drifting, feuding, and occasionally reuniting with estranged collaborators. Over time, his health became more precarious, and age tempered, just slightly, the violent rages that once made headlines. Yet in every public appearance, in every thunderous drum solo, the spirit that had propelled him from Lewisham to global stardom remained unbroken. We're left to wonder whether Ginger Baker was ever truly capable of the quiet life. Could a personality so restlessly creative and so recklessly destructive ever settle into something resembling normalcy? Or did chaos simply course through his veins, driving him to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep playing? His foray into Tuscan olive farming is both a testament to his determination and a stark reminder that some natures cannot be tamed. In the end, Baker's refusal to conform, his tireless push against boundaries, whether musical or personal, defined him as one of rock's most unforgettable figures. Even in the stillness of an Italian orchard, the storm that raged inside him was never far behind. Maybe that's why, all these years later, we're still talking about the man who could pound the drums with the fury of 1,000 cannon blasts, then vanish into the mountains, only to emerge locked in another battle. It might be the ultimate paradox of Ginger Baker, the search for peace in a life designed for war. So the question lingers. If he'd somehow made peace with himself, would we still revere him the same way? Or was it the never-ending struggle that fueled his genius and etched his legend into rock history? One thing is certain. There will never be another like him, and the olive trees that once trembled under the Tuscan sun might still echo with the faint thunder of his distant drums.